Okay, this is episode 13 of Esports Salon. 13, insert crap jokes about it being an unlucky number, but we are lucky to be joined by our guests today to discuss a topic which is going to be about roster locks. And in this particular example, obviously recently we had the ESL League where the finals are coming up, and so some people were unhappy about certain players not being able to use players for that. Obviously, there's a broader topic about roster locks, like for the major, apparently SK won't be able to use bolts. So there's a few different areas here, and I want to talk about some specific cases, but also the more abstract general principles of how we decide rules in esports and what's fair and what isn't. And so my guest for this episode, in the top right-hand corner, is the Flying DJ, who is the Senior Vice President of Product at ESL, because I have an all right memory when people tell me things 2 minutes ago. Don't really know what that term actually means, but I have noticed, like, I actually think that's why a lot of those terms were invented. You're not really supposed to, like, they're supposed to sound really good, but who really knows what that means? Like, I don't even know what the senior part means, but okay, it exists. He does. All you need to know is he's got a title like that. He works at ESL, so make your own conclusions. You know, he is here to play a certain role. No, he's obviously here to represent in this equation ESL, and also a key reason as to why I invited to this show is because Ulrich is someone who himself has been vocal on Twitter. When these sorts of topics come up, he gives his thoughts on it, or he gives the perspective of some insight from ESL. Now, people probably understand that in this particular instance, he has been, at least in the past, in favour of these roster locks. The other guest is going to be Lurppis, former pro player, current analyst and commentator and whatever technical role you take up when you go to these events nowadays, and journalist to a degree, does articles, etc. And obviously in this particular instance, I mean, just as an insight for people when I make the show, a lot of the episodes of this show have actually come from when people just have Twitter debates, because the problem is everyone knows Twitter's not a very good format, even with the 280 characters now, to have a real discussion. You know, at best you can only sort of like, you're saying like sentences to each other and then wait for the other guy to reply, and then it's actually even worse when people do the massive chains of tweets, you know, that it just goes completely to shit. So usually if it's a good discussion, I like to actually try and have a proper talk show, because then people can have proper response, make a comment, people can listen, make their own comments. So let's start here, okay? On this particular topic, let's start with some specifics, because I want to just check, like, so, Lurppis, do you know the exact details? Okay, if we talk about the ESL Pro League example, as far as I know, the two teams we're talking about are Team Liquid using Steel and not being able to, and therefore using Zeus, and then SK Gaming wanting to use bolts. And are they, for Pro League, allowed to use bolts?
Yeah, bolts can play for SK at the finals, at least.
So for the EPL one, it's just the Steel and Team Liquid. Is that the one contention, Lurppis?
Well, I think the Astralis case probably also one that's been discussed.
Right. So Astralis obviously had an issue where it was actually not even a roster move. It was related to ill health from Device, who had to literally, on the doctor's orders, can't play anymore. And in this particular setting, is it that they're going to use Zonic? Are they going to use their coach as the stand-in?
No, they're using Rubino now.
Yes.
So that's
so they're going to use Rubino, who obviously wasn't playing for Astralis and presumably will not join Astralis full time. Right? Okay, let's start there then, Ulrich. Right? In the case of the Rubino's addition to Astralis, is that some sort of like an exception to the rules? Like, presumably he wasn't listed as a sub, right?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the general idea, and just to make it clear, this isn't my opinion necessarily that I'm presenting, but to a degree, it's also the opinion of people in the company, but I think more broadly of the Western team. So all of the transfer regulations, especially for Pro League, they aren't a product of us, but there was basically a working group within the Western teams that developed the rules, then went through a couple of rounds of feedback, and then it became final. So ultimately, it's something that the teams influenced to a large extent, even though the technical details were obviously contributed to. So,
okay. In that case, then, just as a quick aside, does that mean, like, in the past, before WISA was set up for example, you know, the first couple of seasons of Pro League were before then, were the rules in this particular sense different? Do you know?
Yeah, so I think the season before, I don't remember the exact details, but I think you were able to exchange 4 players throughout the entire season. Right. And there wasn't any lock, from what I remember. So you had those 4 switch opportunities, basically. And if they happened at the beginning of the season or at the end of the season, it didn't really matter. So there wasn't a specific there's a deadline. There's obviously a couple of ESEA rules that were always in place. So if you came from a lower division, then I think the roster locked before playoffs, so that if you were playing to get in the upper division, basically, you didn't exchange players last minute, taking a couple of star players to then win relegation, those types of things. So there's actually been a change in transfer regulations for Pro League from last season to this one. Okay. And I think the key element is that you're basically allowed to exchange 2 players during the season. And then on the day before the second to last
match
play day, the roster locks. And after that, it's no longer possible to exchange players. And exchange means if they're not on the roster yet of your team. So you can list, obviously, your core players and a couple of subs.
How does it work for the subs, by the way? Like, are they not allowed to be in the league? Like, they can't be playing for other teams that are active in the same division? How does it work?
Yeah, so they can't be on other Pro League teams. You can only be on one Pro League team at a time. So you could play it for an MDL team, for example.
Yes.
But you can't play for another Pro League team, or you can't be a sub for another Pro League team.
Yes. Okay.
And then there are obviously exceptions that can be made. And I think a good example is, and something that's been, well, in a couple of articles, it was almost portrayed as if we wouldn't allow someone like Device to be replaced, even though he's very sick. And that's not the case. I think that's it's something that players or that teams should obviously account for in the subs that they list. But we can see how it's permanent. And obviously, he was recently at one of our events, so it's not something that is not serious or that they just make up to replace a player. It's a very valid reason to exchange a player. So absolutely fine to big brand. Yeah.
Yes, I interrupted when you were explaining, but basically in the case of Rubino replacing Device, this wasn't someone who either was obviously a transfer or listed as a sub. He's it's an exception made by the admins of the league itself.
Exactly. So the initial request by Astralis was to use Dennis. But Dennis had been playing for Godsend, obviously, throughout the entire season, and also past the deadline and up until the very last match day. So that is something that, although there aren't hard-cut rules, I mean, that's an emergency transfer like that, there isn't a specific ruling yet, maybe that comes in the future, where it says the player can't have been X or can't have been Y because it's an exception. But we talked to all the admins on our end, and then also to the working group within WESA, and the consensus was that exchange would be fine. It could also be players that have played for a different Pro League team, but just not past the transfer deadline. And specifically because we just denied Liquid the request to use Steel, who'd been playing for IMT past the deadline. So obviously that would have been a different treatment of a very similar situation. So that's why ultimately Astralis were basically told they can use anyone as long as he hasn't played for another Pro League team past the transfer deadline.
Okay. So, Lurppis, obviously some of this has evolved since the initial Twitter argument. Like that, initially it was before people knew that Rubino would play, for example. And that's why I want to separate out the topics, because whether Astralis uses someone when they've got a sick player is different from if Team Liquid decides we don't want Stanislaw on our team and we want a player we think is better, and he happens to have played the whole season for someone else, and then they add him to a team. So in this particular instance, either with the Astralis one or with Team Liquid using Steel, what is your contention, or what is your issue with either of these cases?
Well, I mean, my issue more broadly, I would say, is just with the rule sets in general, not necessarily for this season, because I fully understand that you agree to a rule set at the beginning of the season, and then it is what it is. But I think on a broader level, I think the current rule set is flawed for Counter-Strike. I think it's very arbitrary to set it at one game before the final match day. I'm not really sure what's the reasoning. A lot of the time, it won't be the final match day that's going to decide which teams are going to go to the finals, which are not. A lot of the teams are going to be out way before them. For example, Immortals is a good example, where they really had no chance, I think, the entire season, because this was the season right after the KNG incident. So the whole team just completely blew up. So then it is, looking from the outside, and I think it's a little funny that just because one person happened to join the roster a couple days before the other, or maybe a week before another, that they get treated differently when the actual actual underlying situation is very similar. As for device, I mean, I think it does make sense that you have a slightly different rule set for someone who actually gets sick and can't play as a result. So, for example, something that I mentioned on Twitter was that the time when Dupree got sick during I think it was ESL Cologne 2016, yes. And Valve forced Astralis to play with Zonic. I thought that was kind of ridiculous, especially because he can't actually have proper subs in the majors. But I suppose that's a little different from the EPL discussion. But I mean, I just think the main issue is that you can't really have first of all, there's no optimal sub, because you don't know before when a season starts whether it's Device who's going to get sick or if it's Dupree who's going to get sick. Sure, and obviously the same player is not going to be an optimal sub for both of them. That's already a huge issue in the way that roles work in Counter-Strike. And obviously the second thing is it's just very hard to get good subs for your team, because all the good players are going to be playing, especially when you have what is it in EPL now? 12 teams?
14
teams. Yeah, exactly. So 14 teams, and that's both Europe and North America. So really, you have to have a player outside of the top 28 teams. I mean, obviously not full 28, because there's a lot of better European teams outside than in North America. But still, there's 28 teams that you can pick from that. That's fairly slim pickings. That's why you end up with situations like Fnatic using that Broline kid, who's I think 15 at the WESG finals, just because you just can't get other people to stand in because everybody's under contract. So I think that's the big issue, where ultimately the real issue that I have with any of this is it's the fans that suffer. It's the people who are actually watching the game at home or on site at the event. Those are the people who actually pay the price for any of these player issues.
Right, let me ask you this question then. So first of all, I mean, it's actually a very key point that Ulrich laid out there, which was that I even saw some people who were figurehead people in the industry acting as though ESL decided all of this. They have a whole system in place with Visa, which is the teams that there are a number of European teams where they can actively have a say in how some of these rules are crafted. And presumably in certain instances, I know from knowing some of the players, remember, everyone now complains, that they're not that big a fan of having, some people complain about the Swiss system now, or some people complain about they don't like the best of one round robins. These systems were put in place thanks to players asking for them. So this is one of those areas I always point out that players can be hypocritical, because what they'll do is they'll say behind the scenes, I want this thing put in place. Then when it's put in place, the same guy might come out 3 months later and be like, why do we have this rubbish format? I hate this format. My team went out, it's bullshit. And unfortunately, the reason it's a bit dirty is, the fan doesn't keep track of all this deal. He doesn't know that the player had some say. He thinks, stupid bloody company doing the wrong thing. The players are against it, right? Let me ask you this, lurppis. When you say that only the fans suffer in this particular instance, what I haven't seen so far on Twitter from you is, as far as I can tell, the only actual parameters you gave as an alternative was what we currently have for the major, which is to have a 3 out of 5 system for the slot with players and just let people presumably have no roster lock, right?
Yeah, I think that's the best way to do it for Counter-Strike.
Okay. Let me give you an example, okay? I want you to give me your perspective on this.
Uh-huh.
So, in every single season of EPL, there'll nearly always be one team that's a borderline team, or even sometimes a shock that gets to the Pro League finals, right? Yeah. So let's imagine, right? I'll just give you one off the top of my head. Let's say that
Hellraisers this season is a good example for your point.
Hellraisers then. So Hellraisers makes it this season, right?
Let's
say they go and get any superstar player. They can go and get, they can go to Cloud9 if they want. They can go and get fucking Stewie 2K. They can go and get some amazing, any superstar player would give Hellraiser's team probably a better chance at the LAN finals. So in that setting, here's my question. If you allow them to just take another Pro League player who didn't qualify, don't the other teams at the Pro League finals suffer because this team got to get a free super sub?
I mean, I actually outlined a second alternative for this, but I'll answer your question first anyway. I don't think that's necessarily wrong. If I'm the fan, I'm watching EPL starting on Tuesday, and if Hellraisers could have picked up Simple as their 5th for, I think they actually have do they actually have a stand-in? I think one of their players maybe couldn't go. But I think if Hellraiser would have been able to pick up Simple, I think that would have made the event far more interesting as a fan. As for the other teams, I mean, how good of a team are you actually? Because this is supposed to be the best teams in the world. It's not like one of those scenarios we had 2 years back, I think, when Guardian was playing games in like lower tier leagues when Navi wasn't in there or something. He was just dominating bad players. Like it's not like a situation like that. Like if this is the very top of Counter-Strike, and if you think that your team actually is so weak that you just get a better player even though he's never played with your team or anything like that, and you actually end up better, then I'm not sure if that's an issue. But I do hear the other side of the argument where some people do feel that way, especially the teams who...
Put it this way, okay, when you say that, okay, right, let me just stop there a second. Like, I'll definitely, you can continue your point, but I'll give you another analogy, okay? Let's say that for the Champions League in football, like I realize football's a different scenario, there's different subs. We're not talking about subs here, okay? I'm just talking about a similar scenario, right? Let's say that Barcelona don't get out of the group stage, but then for the playoffs, for some bizarre reason, one of the weakest teams in the playoffs go, you know what, we'll just have Messi on our team for the playoffs, right? In that setting, don't get me wrong, I bet it'd be brilliant for the fans to see Messi as a one-off playing in this team. And you know what? It'd probably be really fun to watch him play against a better team, you know. But if you're one of the teams made to the playoffs, you'd be pretty justified in being like, why do they get to have the best player in the world be on their team for this thing? And the whole point is here, right? I disagree with you, by the way. It's very rare people would do this. But when you create rules, you can't just go, oh, well, it probably won't happen. If you know the way rules work, it could be exploited. You can't allow the possibility. So it doesn't seem like you particularly care for the other teams in that sense, right?
Yeah, but I'm not sure that in Counter-Strike a lot of the time it works the same way, where if you just get someone like Messi in soccer and he's obviously going to make your team better, I don't think there's any question about that. I'm not sure if a lot of the time it's going to work that way in CS, where if you replace someone, your team play is going to be so different, the way you play is going to be so different. Now, admittedly, this is going to help teams. It's going to work better for teams like, well, actually like Hellraisers or FaZe, who aren't so tactical, where you can just sort of plug someone in. But I'm not sure if it's necessarily such a huge upgrade a lot of the time.
Didn't it just happen for Astralis, who were one round away from winning the Blast Pro Series? In part because, you know, no opponent could ever scout them, could have any clue how they were going to play. Dennis actually had MVP level numbers. It literally just happened, mate. They almost won the event.
Yeah, I wouldn't use...
I'm not saying it would happen every time, but it just literally almost happened, right?
Yeah, and yet every single team at that event, if you asked them before, would you rather have Astralis play with Dennis or Device, they would have said Dennis. Okay. So it's not like they actually went for a better player there. I don't think anybody would think that. At least I definitely don't think so. Okay. And also, I just don't think this would happen a lot of the time. I think very rarely would there be a situation where someone would just effectively bench someone on their team.
Sure.
And just say, okay, well, by the way, even though you've been playing with us for the last year, this really good player over here is now available, so he's going to be playing with us in at the EPL finals.
Okay.
Well, and sorry,
come on. Jump in.
I think it's a fair point, and I get it, but unfortunately, when you make rules, then you can't just go off of probability, right? You can't go off, this probably won't happen. I think the really difficult part about making proper rules is that you need to word them or construct them in a way that they can catch all scenarios. I mean, not the totally unrealistic ones, obviously, that ones you don't need to account for, but everything that is possible needs to be accounted for. And I think as part of that, it sometimes catches cases where I think individually in that case, you would probably say this should be allowed, but it's really tough to make them understandable and not too granular, but still have them account for the possibility, right? Like, I mean, I think as a team that your expectation, if you've played a season of Pro League, if you made it to the last match day, and Hellraisers have barely made the finals, you probably think, you know, they're one of the teams that might not make it far. And then they go and get Simple, who's had an insane weekend. And if he has that same weekend next time, you have no idea beforehand. They might just get it on a few days' notice, that replacement. I think that is something that really invalidates some of the performance that those teams have had over the season. And I think, I mean, I agree with you that a lot of those questions about rules, if we asked ourselves what's best for the product, we'd probably throw the rules out of the window. And sure. I totally agree with you that the 2016 ES1 Cologne, I don't think that was a good rule in the way that it was ultimately put through. I don't think it was a good tournament for Astralis, and that's why we felt especially difficult about the situation, because we've had Astralis at one of our tournaments before, and we had them play with Zonic and we couldn't do anything about it, even though we felt that this was really harsh because, I mean, what happened to Dupre was he had to go to the hospital. There was no way around it. So having him, replaced by a coach for the entire tournament, that was pretty tough, and it's probably not something that we thought was something that should happen at every event. But at the same time, we needed to make a decision that was within the rules and that didn't invalidate everything that other teams had also abided by, because I think that's the other side. And one thing you've said, right? Teams have transfer regulations. I mean, a lot of them will play by those transfer regulations the entire season. Some of them might make roster decisions based on those regulations. If someone else can then circumvent them, that's just a competitive disadvantage for following the rules, and that's not something that we want to happen.
Okay. Right. Okay, Ross, I've got a question for you then, Lurppis. Right. In theory, your premise is like I'm not in favor of any roster lock, right?
Yeah, I'm of the laissez-faire school of thought.
So let me ask you this, right? At the EPL Pro League finals, Astralis come along, right? And when they sit down, it is Simple who sat there. And the other team's like, what? And then they're like, oh no, because remember, we're no roster lock. There's no roster lock. So he just sat down. It's Simple there. And you know what? You're not going to believe this, Lurppis. When they go to play the next team, who was just watching them play, it's only bloody Stewie 2K sat there, isn't it? And you're like, what the fuck? It was Simple last game. Are you in favour of that?
I don't think that's going to happen.
I didn't ask. I never asked whether that would happen. Scenario. I asked Lurppis, is that fine in your worldview?
Well, in this scenario, maybe Ulrich is right, and maybe you want to lock the rosters before the finals then separately. Maybe that's what you do. You lock the roster before the finals, barring situations where someone gets hospitalized or something.
Right.
Let's say a visa issue comes along, like happened with NIP at MLG Columbus. That was another one where you couldn't really do anything about it. But I think it's fine to lock the rosters for say the finals event, so you can't just have like a massive rotation of players, something like that. But I still don't necessarily think that it's wrong. I think like Ulrich said, I think it's a better product if you let players play. At the same time, I fully understand the other side of the coin, which is that it does sort of allow you to do anything. It's kind of bad for some of the other teams who actually play by the rules, play with their full roster, don't try to sort of gimmick their way through. But in that scenario, I think today there's a way where you could actually word it, because of how contracts work these days, where you actually have proper contracts with buyouts and everything, where you just have whoever is, I guess for ESL tournaments, it would be WISA, who would be the sort of like the governing body. Sure. So you just have them sort of validate that, say, before Simple can play with Astralis, he must have actually signed a proper contract, taken care of whatever buyout his previous contract has, things like that. And I think that effectively solves the situation for times where someone is just temporarily moving somewhere else with no long-term impact, in a way where it is deemed that it sort of goes against the spirit of competition, I guess you would say.
Okay, I've got one more hypothetical for you, because this episode's not just going to be me posing all the hypotheticals that could ever happen. No. Probably won't happen. That segment will end after this one. Right? Here's the other question I have for you. Okay, let's imagine a scenario that just abides by everything you just said there. So what happens is, right, for some reason, there's going to be an NA shuffle. And what happens is Team Liquid, and let's just pick a team. So let's say Optic, right? Two teams, like in theory, in the NA division, right? In this scenario, these two teams decide to do a player shuffle of two players. And two players from Liquid go to Optic, and two players from Optic go to Liquid. It's actually a perfect swap, There's no like three teams involved or anything. It's just two players from each, right? Here's a problem. When you do the LAN finals, your placing in the league determines your seed. So now when we do the seedings, how do we alter the seedings based on the current rules? Like the seedings would be, if Team Liquid was higher seeded, they might lose two of their players. They've got two new players, they still get the same seed. Whereas maybe Optic was the last seed and they get the best players now. You don't have a problem with that?
I don't think you can do anything about that.
Oh, it can stop it from happening.
I don't see how that's necessary. I think the majority of the players have gained the seeding. I think you stick by the majority rule in Counter-Strike for as long as there's no broad use of substitutes. As long as you actually stick to five player rosters, which I believe is going to be forever as long as Counter-Strike is played. I think you just stick to the majority rule. I see your point. I mean, obviously that let's say if let's say if Device and Dupree left Astralis the day before the major roster lock and they got 2 players from North Academy, I mean, they actually wouldn't be a Legends team at that point. But then again, exactly. Like that problem already exists to begin with, so I'm not sure if there really is anything that can be done about it.
Major system is what you're saying as well, right? It would be the same if that happened for their major spot.
Sure.
Okay. Right. Ulrich, when people decide these sorts of rules, are players themselves like this is one of the areas I feel like never gets represented, because in this setting, right, it's kind of a political game. And if you, like, let's say I'll pick a hypothetical player. Let's say for some reason MSL from North is actually secretly in favor of this ruling, and not just because it's Astralis, but he actually doesn't think he should be allowed emergency subs, or he doesn't think you should be allowed a roster. I'm just picking a hypothetical. I don't know his opinion. It's just purely for hypothetical purposes, right? It's very unlikely in some cases that the person will think, well, why would I volunteer that information? The rules are as they are anyway. They're going to be enforced. You know, I don't need to come out and publicly say it. And in fact, if everyone's in favor of this thing and I'm against it, it's just going to make me look bad. When these rules are decided, are there actually players who themselves want these things and they're proposing these things and they're saying, oh, it should be 2 players, or you shouldn't be allowed to change players, or you should have to have the sub signed up? Are they actually in favor of those things?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We tend to have player meetings in most of our bigger events, and obviously, since one of our promises to players, we don't disclose what they say in those meetings. But there's a surprising number of players that are in favor of stricter rules. Much stricter than we would even want them to be, and that's interesting because I think when those debates are going public, then it always feels like. Everybody would allow everyone, right?
Yes,
and
it feels like players versus the org, right?
Yeah, and then sometimes, I think in this case, people have asked us, well, just ask all the teams in the finals if they want to allow Dennis, and if they want to, then it's fine. But I think that's something that creates an impossible situation where the players can only lose because they either say yes and they accept something that is against the rules initially and potentially worse for them. Yeah. Or they say no, and then they lose publicly because everybody will just tell them they're afraid of playing against Dennis. So that's why I think this happened a few times, right? Teams have been asked if they want to restart a round or not in the past.
Yes, exactly.
That's been really bad. So I think one of our guidelines has always been that we make those decisions and we take the flag for whatever the flag may be, but it's not something that we would put on the players. But I think especially in the transfers, I think players are they aren't as much for the free for all system as people tend to think they are, and I think that's because there's a lot of stability in it for them as well, and I think that's something that they're looking for, right? The players ultimately, if we have a free for all system where they can be exchanged at all times, that means if they have a few bad tournaments, they're going to get cut. And they're going to be benched. And I think for a player these days, that's probably the worst situation they can be in because they cannot play. They have insane buyouts. So they'll just be sitting there, not doing anything. And I think we've seen, I don't know which player it was exactly, who basically said, I'm going to retire because I have a really high buyout.
I think it was Smooya, right? It was Smooya from Epsilon, I believe,
Who said, well, I can't do it like this. I'm benched. I can't play. I can't remember, So that's something, and I think it's understandable why players, for that reason, want something where they at least have security that not, at every second they could potentially be replaced, but where the system restricts them in a way. At the same time, I think that's something that needs to be constantly looked at, and we certainly don't think that what we currently have is the final and ultimate version of how it needs to be, and certainly when the roster lock is, if there's one, that's the point of debate, right? Is it, and I get it, is it fair that one match makes that difference? But you can say that for any point where you make the roster lock, if you don't lock it at the beginning of the season, but that's not going to work in today's environment. At the same time, if you look at majors currently and how far the minors are from the actual event, then that's obviously something that also needs to be addressed, because at a time where it used to be an 8-week window, or maybe a 12-week window, it used to work maybe to some extent. But now if it's 5 months, it's probably not going to work anymore. So I think that's something that we need to constantly look at. But I think we see an overall desire for more stability on all sides. And to me, that doesn't mean we're going to say there's a transfer period in the beginning and then half of the season and that's it. There's nothing else. we certainly know that we're not the only tournament out there. And I don't think actually we're the strictest one. I think if you look at E-League, for example, I think they've had a few cases where teams wanted to exchange a few players and it just wasn't possible at all. And I think even cases where SK, the entire lineup switched. They were basically thrown out of the league. That's something we would probably look at in an individual case, because that's not something we really think is great for the league when an entire line of players is removed from it. But there's so many factors in play that the only way to find out is if you actually use it. And I think nobody paid attention to the transfer regulations when we published them, because nobody reads rules. They only read them once it becomes obvious that this is now in the way.
That's true for sure.
Yeah. So now that it's in the way of something they want to do, they all start paying attention. And I think we'll get more feedback. And to us, I mean, we like the public debate, but the public debate to us isn't, this is our roster system, please accept it. Here are arguments why it needs to be like that. But it's more of we think it's good that these factors are being debated in public. And there are a few things where we think that it's not going to happen automatically. And one thing you brought up is, our team's going to have subs on their lineups. And I don't know if that's going to happen. I think 2 or 3 years ago, nobody would have thought that they have full-time coaches who get significant salary. And now that's changed.
There's a certain someone in this conversation who already wrote about that 4 or 5 years ago, but continue.
Okay, well, so not a lot of people, right? I would have said that coaches are going to be a key part, and most of them are glorified managers at that point. Mm-hmm. And then the other point is, how can we get to that sub? I mean, I understand that it's a lot of money to invest. I mean, it used to be a lot of money to invest in a coach, but now these teams just do it because it makes sense, at least for the majority of them. And for subs, I think we've constructed a few ways where we can think this is how we can get there. And one thing that we had in the rules, and we need to see how we adjust it, is that if you have an academy team in MDL, for example, then you can use players from that lineup as subs. So they can play in MDL all season, and they can freely move up to your team. I mean, they can't be moved downwards, but they can be used as subs on your team. But so that removes the element of you have to have 2 subs and maybe they don't fit the right players. But you can actually have an entire lineup potentially and use that to draw from, which might help bridge the gap between where we are now and where teams ultimately should be, having a sub, because as we can see, it's dramatic for those lineups. If a player gets sick, it changes everything. It's really a coin toss, and doesn't always work like it did for Dennis, I think.
Yes.
But a big part of the problem with the academy thing is we saw what happened with Fnatic, right? Where they were just forced to dispose of the team as they got good. So, like to some extent, like you can have an academy team as long as they're bad, and then once they actually get good enough that they'd be helpful to you in a situation, then you actually can't have them anymore, because otherwise it would be a problem if they ever played against one another in a tournament.
I will say this, lurppis, like I actually have some experience with this myself, because basically this happened in League of Legends. In League of Legends, you weren't allowed to have 2 teams that are in LCS, but they have a division like MDL that's below LCS. It's called Challenger Series over there. And what happened was you could have a team in Challenger. Now, yes, you're right. If the team gets too good, if it basically wins Challenger and qualifies for LCS, you have to sell the team. You can't have 2 teams in LCS. Obvious conflict of interest. I mean, I realize CSGO people are like, holy fuck, what? Conflict of interest? But yeah, that's actually a real thing, by the way. But anyway, jokes aside. But what happened in that scenario, believe it or not, was it actually didn't end up being a negative. Because what used to happen was you used to sell the team, and someone else would be like, well, of course I want an LCS team. An LCS spot has value. I will buy it off you. And, at the time, it actually used to be quite a lot. It used to be like $1 million for NA LCS. So in this setting, I mean, that's an area that I never came into this discussion, I notice, which is that having EPL slots. I saw the guy from HLTV when he talked about this, made it sound like, well, EPL's just a league. Who cares? Like there's all these other tournaments that affect it. No. When people buy teams, if the team is in EPL, the price for the team goes way up compared to if the team is like an amazing team, like think about some of the teams that aren't in ECS, like fucking Navi, I think North isn't. Those teams would have a lower buyout value, by the way, if you bought the entire squad, because they don't have the league spots, so they don't have that guaranteed exposure of hours and in the top league, etc. Like, it actually is a factor where I agree. It'd suck for the org. Like, if Astralis has their team in the MDL and they have good players and then they get promoted, yeah, you have to get a new team, but you also probably could sell that team perhaps for more than you put in. You know, you could perhaps even make a profit from it. It could even be an industry in itself.
Sure, but I mean, it still does cap the quality of the players you might be able to have as substitutes. That was the main point. Okay. Is they can never be sort of on a comparable level.
Yeah, I think agreed, but at the same time, it would remove entirely the need for a sub that doesn't play anywhere, but it's a sub that, again, I think it's maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. I think in the Astralis case, they just got way too good, way too fast. Maybe there are other academy teams that, you know, are more set up for that, or teams actually have.
But yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Or Fnatic, sorry.
Yeah.
So. Maybe, you know, at some point that actually becomes a thing, that teams build their own players from their academy teams. But then again, and I think that's also a thing that we see. I mean, we look at this and we see it might work in other sports. You know, everything that works there is going to work in esports, right? And I know that's a big point of your argument, that we should basically forget everything that happens in sports. And I don't fully agree. I think there's things to be learned, but at the same time, I also agree that things are significantly different how they are in sports than how they are in esports. And I think a lot of the rules that we currently have reflect it. And every time someone's tried to blindly copy it one to one, it traditionally failed. But ultimately, I think some things are probably going to come in, just because if this becomes something that is a job for players, they're probably going to want less volatility, and the same for sponsors, same for every organization. And I think a good example for how bad things still are is what happened to Immortals, went from finals at the major to one player threatens someone on social media, the entire team falls apart now. They've withdrawn from EPL. If that can happen within 5 months, I think there's still some things to be done about stability. And that, as someone who's recently invested into Immortals, like AG, for example, they must have thought, what is this industry? I mean, this is, they've gone from having a really valuable world-class Counter-Strike team to having no lineup at all. And there was nothing in place to restrict that. And sure, I get maybe you can't do anything about players being dumb and forcing stuff like that. And then, other players following them and the team falling apart. That's probably something that's tough to do. But at the same time, I think it's a bit of a question of opportunity cost. How much does it cost you to be stupid? And if the cost is too high, then maybe you think twice, or you just have a different perspective on how you deal with those things, and you try to work together much more than you did before. So I think there's a way to get there through tiny steps that aren't necessarily the same as in traditional sports.
Okay. Well, one thing I would add is I think the key element to this whole discussion, both of the points that you guys actually made, is the fact that it sort of relies on having a franchise model for the top league. Because if you have that for, say, LCS, you get the spot for a lifetime. I think EPL you actually don't. I think ECS is the one where, because it's full revenue share, that you actually, if you have a spot, then you just have a spot. And that's why North, for example, were left out, because the bad Dignitas team got the spot when they changed organizations. Yes. But basically, if we were to have like one, I mean, I realize this is going to be dangerously close to a whole other topic, so I'll keep it short and we don't have to continue down this route. But if you were to have like a top franchise level league, then I agree that it would make a lot more sense to have like a farm system. But currently, if you think about it, how expensive it is just to pay the salaries for like the very best Counter-Strike teams, I think it's going to be hard to justify putting up the cost for 5 other players, even if it's not that much, because it is still like a couple $100,000 every year.
As far as I know, the rules actually are almost the same between EPL and ECS, that the spot actually belongs to the org. It's just, as far as I remember, in EPL, they had the clause that said at the same time, though, the org can't just like bring in like their 5 of their cousins, and have them play. It has to be a team of like similar level. So for example, it famously happened with Winter Fox, where they brought in that like Australian New Zealand team to the NA squad thing, and the whole thing is because it was like debatable as to whether like the lineup they had before that was like XP3 and Rix or something, some people like that, or Lex rather, because it was debatable as to like whether like one was better than the other. I think it was just allowed, and so as far as I know, EPL also, like, it's not a franchise model. You can definitely get relegated from EPL. Let me just ask Virtus Pro about that, but it is certainly the case that it's, as far as I know, the org actually is involved. Because by the way, that's a detail. I want Ulrich to jump in on this, but I'll just say this, lurppis. That's another consequence of kind of the free-for-all world that you're promoting, which is that, if I had to guess, you probably aren't a fan of the org having the spot as well over the players. But think of this. In a world where the org doesn't have the slot, Immortals doesn't just take the major slot. They now have, as in the ex-Immortals players, KNG, etc., they'd now have the EPL slot. So sorry, no, Winston, you can fuck off, mate. We're taking your EPL spot that you put all that money into, and that's now Villamix. We're in the EPL, you know, like that would happen, because that would just be a consequence of what's happened. Yeah, but then it comes down to which side of the coin you look at it, because I've also talked about this quite a bit before. Okay, Two-Face, what side of the coin are you looking at? EPL would be far better off if you had the Villamix, the clubbers playing there next season, instead of whichever team Immortals does or does not field. I think the league would be far more interesting. I think everybody would rather watch KNG and those guys. That is if he ever does make it back to the US, by the way. That's yes. I think there's a certain risk element there. But if he does ever make it back across the border to the US or play from Canada, then I think the league itself would be better off with having those guys in there. The fans would like to watch it. I don't know that Cloud9 would like to watch it. I think they'd rather enforce the rules and let's keep the rosters as they are. Okay, so anyway...
yeah, and I think there's just one more thing on that. I think that's always the conflict that we're in. I think we've seen what the system that the major has can bring. I think the most famous case is Penta and Mousesports, where an org has invested into players and then just take the major spot, and that's it. Yeah. So that has severe downside for the organizations.
And, if you remember, it would have happened to Godsent and Fnatic, but it didn't because Crims went back just before the E-League. Yeah. Otherwise, Godsent also would have just taken Fnatic's spot, if you remember.
Exactly. And then the other case is if you have a pure org-based model, then orgs can basically do whatever they want. The players have no power at all.
Hold the players hostage, yes.
So that's what we wanted to do, and how we set up our rules is that it serves as a compromise that the players can't just take the slot, but the org also just doesn't retain it. And that obviously leaves a subjective element in there where we basically have to judge if the new lineup is appropriate or not. And it's not done, just one person looks at it, but it's done through a panel. But I think ultimately we don't like rules where there's a lot of subjective element. But to us at the moment, it's the only way to resolve that conflict where it's neither player heavy nor org heavy.
Okay. Right, well, I mean, come on, jump in.
The one thing I will say is a lot of this conversation, I think when people listen to this will notice that it comes down to the view of, are we focusing on the way the CS circuit is currently, which is the open circuit? Because I mean, that basically is the whole argument, is as long as we do have the full open circuit, then for as long as that's the case, I think we need the loser roster change rules. Now,
loser.
At the same time, I think that at some point we probably will have someone. I think ESL already tried. This was 2015, was it? To have like a big actual exclusive league to sort of close everything else out.
So I think that was
just a rumor.
Just a rumor. My bad. But anyway, I mean, at some point, I do think we'll end up there where we actually have one league that is sort of the equivalent of the NBA or the NFL or the NHL, where all the best teams play. And I think that is the scenario where a lot of these strict rules will come into play and will actually make more sense. It'll actually protect the investments, and it just frankly fits together, I think. But I think that part of the problem is that we're sort of applying rules for where we want to be and where we want to build this thing to where we are now. Whereas I think there's a bit of a disconnect between the two.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting question of where the ecosystem is going, and we certainly have products for both, right? We do have a lot of events in the open circuit. We do have a league, and we ultimately think that at the moment that neither on its own would be the best. I mean, people would certainly, I think in the hardcore community, people will probably say what value does a league provide, but it's content.
All the value for for the people putting up the events, basically.
Yeah, but also for people watching, right? It's content during the week, and typically there isn't a lot of content during the week. Everything leads up to obviously weekend events, and they tend to be kind of longer. I get that, but at the same time, it's also content that's easier on the players than anything else. They don't need to travel somewhere; they can play from their home, and that has a whole lot of other downsides, like online CS and how you consider that if it's as valuable as offline CS. But it's something that ties everything together, and I think we've seen to a degree that the roster lock, for example, at the beginning of EPL, there was a key point in the ecosystem where everybody was looking at how do players after the major, where do they go, where do teams go. So it kind of structured it at that point. But at the same time, I mean, ultimately what we would hope is that both can coexist, and there isn't just one league, and there also isn't just an open circuit. Or there's something that can provide for both. I think that continuous storyline, that ability to watch CS during the week and have your favorite team play every time, that's something that's valuable. And at the moment, the league is really the only way to get that. Maybe there's another way, which we haven't figured out yet. But yeah, I think that's also important to understand. I think from our perspective, just the league in CS currently wouldn't be enough. One, it wouldn't be open enough for new teams to come in. And two, it would leave a lot of teams that don't make the finals and then don't have enough exposure. And I think we can see in League of Legends, right, to what extent that also shifts competitiveness, especially if Western and Eastern teams only meet once every year, and then the Western teams always get shafted. So that's not something that ultimately is great. So the CS ecosystem is well set up. I mean, players still go to, and I think we're going away from roster locks a little bit, but players still go to way too many events. So actually, they're the ones who can act. And I think a lot of this, to tie it back into roster locks, a lot of this is on the players. I think the players aren't fully aware of how much impact they can have into the ecosystem. And often they say they want one thing, but then they do another thing. So I think a year ago, we've talked about there's too many events, and then everybody goes to Mykonos. So that type of thing is really something that doesn't make a lot of sense, and where the players actually have a bigger role to play, where they can say, no, this is ours, because ultimately we wouldn't make rules that the players totally hate. There will be some that they don't like, because there's a couple of viewpoints on things, but I think they don't act enough in their own interest, especially when it comes to roster locks. And if people then say, well, let Astralis play with Dennis, I don't know if they've thought it through to the end. I don't know if they've really considered the implications of everything. So that's something that I would put back on the plate of the players, that they can have a bigger impact if they just are more aware of their role in this. Because they have more of a role in football. I mean, the rules are made and the players don't get a say in anything. So that's completely different in CS.
Yeah. Okay, I've got do you have a point here?
No, I was just going to say, like, do you actually think that the players are well positioned to have a big role in saying everything? Because from my experience, the players that I talk to, or the players that I used to play with, a lot of the time you'd have the occasional guy who actually thinks things through, thinks about the implications, like you said. If this happens now, what can happen in the future? How is that going to... All the different connections, I think most people don't think about. I think most people definitely... I would be surprised if 2 players on average per team read a rule book. I think average is probably under 1. And a lot of the time it's the coach who reads it and just tells if there's anything that differs from all the other ones. I think... I just don't think that a lot of the time. Now, admittedly, you also can't just go against the wishes of the players, because they are the people who are actually playing the league. But at the same time, I don't think a lot of the time they are the ones who are actually going to have the best insight into what's going to work and how it should be structured.
Yeah, I think they need good representation. I think in our player meetings, we see a few players that have been around for a while, especially, and they have good ideas, and they think about a lot of those things. But ultimately, what they need, and what we hope, after Vugo is departed, we need someone else for the player council in Wester. But ultimately, we want someone who's a strong spokesperson and represents all players. I think that's one thing that's missing. And I get it, why the players, I don't expect every player to think everything through. Their role is to be really good at CS. They don't need to be good at making rules. They don't need to be good at speaking publicly about them. But it would still be really good to have someone who can better convey what they're interested in. And at the moment, it's very well, today this, tomorrow that, really depending on what the public sentiment is, you get different perspectives by the players on how the rules should be, and that's obviously not great for them. So I think they just need someone really really strong to represent them, who's not afraid of really pushing for their agenda. And I think the public notion is always we're really afraid of a players' union, but we're not. I mean, it would be great to get a better idea of what the players...
It would be easier to negotiate at that point. You actually know what represents the players, yeah.
If I talk to 10 players, they'll probably have at least 5 different opinions on certain topics, and that's not easy to navigate then.
I definitely take the over on the 5. But yeah, Duncan, you were going to chime in.
So I wanted to actually, just as like a final broader topic to discuss, pick one that's actually probably not as contentious, which is the roster lock scenario that exists for the major. Because obviously, technically, I mean, the next major isn't run by ESL, so in theory, you're not representing ESL for that. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. So for this one, the big issue is that at the moment, top 2 team in the world is SK Gaming. And part of them being top 2 at the moment, actually, is that they've been able to bring in bolts and they've successfully transitioned to a slightly different lineup, and they've been doing very well with this lineup, whereas before, the lineup with FOPS was starting to have its issues, hence why they made the player change, and they were starting to cap out, and, the ranking would have gone down over time if they hadn't won events. So, obviously, first of all, from lurppis' perspective on the roster lock, obviously, yes, everyone wants to see SK play with bolts at this major. It'll make it a better major. They might even be able to win the major. But as far as I know, he will not be allowed to play, and it's claimed that it's like, as far as this is like a very complicated thing, because as far as I can tell, the rules for each major have been different. I'm not sure if it's because the different people organizing them, or Valve just updated the rules over time, but people have cited a lot of cases where players had also played an online qualifier for a minor and then they were allowed to play, or players had played a part of a minor or something and they were allowed to play, or players weren't allowed to play when they did. And it seemed like the rules were actually changing major to major to major. So, right, what is your take on that aspect, Ulrich? Because obviously a problem in this instance is that the majors aren't set. And for example, in this particular case, as far as I can tell, so if the last major ended in, I think it was early August, I think it was like, what was it, like the second or
end
third
of July.
Of August? Yeah. Oh, July, right. Yes, sorry, July. So they would have had, SK essentially would have had to have signed bolts before any of the minor process began, which presumably happened like, a month and a half ago. So they would have only basically had like maybe 2 or 3 months in terms of the major cycle where they could absolutely, without any of these other rules changing, have signed bolts. What's your thoughts on that approach for the major?
I mean, I can't really speak for what the current rule set is. I know that when we hosted the last major, there was a specific set of core rules that were necessary that we couldn't define. And I think a large part of that was that there were certain roster locks, and I think for the Legends, they were pretty close to the actual event. But the key element, and I think that hasn't changed, is that once the players played for a team at some point in the major phase, which starts, I mean, I think at that point it started at minors, but now it might extend to qualifiers already. He's locked to that team and he can't play anywhere else. I don't know if that's still the case, but it seems to be, because otherwise yes. I think we wouldn't have that situation. And I think the rest of the rules we typically were able to make on our own. I mean, I have a few issues with how it currently is, especially if it's a major where the phase crosses the calendar year. So that, I mean, that's a typical time when contracts end. So I think that's really difficult to force rules like that, especially when the major then happens in January. I mean, I understand why it was, because ultimately I think the thought process was we don't want any player to help a team go through a minor or to the qualifier and then go back to a legend. Yes. Because there isn't a roster lock for the legends, right? Otherwise, yes. You would need to lock legends maybe at the beginning, and that might be too far given the Counter-Strike ecosystem. So I don't know what the current rule set is. I think the only thing I know is that with how far apart minors and the main event are now, that's definitely something that needs to be looked at.
Okay, let me ask you this then. So basically, would you think that the current rules, whatever they might, again, we don't know the exact specifics, they're very complicated actually. Would you think that the same rules wouldn't be as bad if, for example, this whole process of when you weren't allowed the player from started, say, like a month and a half before the major itself? Like it wasn't, like this is like 2 or 3 months out we're talking at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's the closer we get to the major, the more sense it makes to me. So if we lock the roster, say beginning of December, that's then 2 months, and that I think would make a lot of sense. But like this, I think there's a lot of time that happens in CS, and I mean I agree with lurppis, right? You can't force some things. You won't make the CSGO scene be stable for a year just by creating certain rules that say you have to be. So at the end of the day, I'm not even sure it serves the initial purpose anymore, because I think by the point the major comes around, people have completely forgotten who played for who at the minor. So when it was relatively close together time-wise, I think it makes sense. It's really weird to see that one player play a minor, and then all of a sudden he's representing someone else at the major. But with how far it is apart now, I don't think it serves the initial purpose anymore.
Okay.
So the famous example of this, where the rules somewhat changed, was Disco Dublin played for Epsilon at the minor before the E-League Atlanta major. So basically, he went from playing for one team at the minor and then playing for Fnatic at the major itself. So he actually was able to change teams. And then for now Bolts, he only played in the minor qualifier. He didn't even play at the minor because Immortals didn't qualify there, I don't think. And he's still not allowed to play for SK, which is surprising because this is actually E-League too. It's not a different organizer. And Fallen actually said on Twitter when I tweeted about this some time ago, I looked up the tweet now, he said, Valve said it's up to the organizers actually. I tried to make contact and they led me to E-League. What we needed to play with full roster was done before for Disco Dublin less than a year ago, but they now won't do it for us. So that's the obvious disconnect, right? Because not only is it a worse situation, or was it a worse situation before? Because Dublin actually played at the minor itself, not just a random online qualifier where, like, someone who might be coming back to the scene might actually just show up to play for friends, might actually quickly move up in a couple months that the qualification process takes, and then get onto a good team. Like, no, he actually played at the minor, and now Bolts only played the online qualifiers. They don't even qualify for the minor itself. And he's still not allowed to play. And it's an E-League event when Fallen said that it's actually up to some extent at least, he said that from speaking to Valve that it's up to the organizer.
Yeah, I think you can make rules that are stricter than what Valve asks from you. I mean, like I said, we haven't run a major in a while, so I'm not 100% sure how it's set up for this. But I think what we've always had, for example, from our side, is we had the cheating bans based on VAC and whatever else bans, and then we had ESL bans. So that was obviously stricter than what would have needed to be done, so it was always fine. And I could imagine the same is true in that case, and then maybe that's something which obviously I don't know if that's the case, but maybe E-League decided that they want this type of lock for the entire process and not just from the minor or not just from the qualifier.
Sure. But I fully agree on the other point you made, though, that the whole qualification process timeline is now far too long. So, like Duncan said, the last major ended in late July. I think it was like the last couple of days of July, the very end. And then the minor qualifiers started in, I think, early October. So it's a 3-month period. And then that whole problem actually gets compounded by the fact that, like you said, Ulrich, the contract period that people normally are on is until the end of December. And then that's actually right before the major. So I actually, obviously, most people won't have this kind of knowledge, so it won't bother the average fan as much as it did me. But last year, I was really bummed going into the E-League major, which is, by the way, supposed to be the number one event of the year, or one of the top 2 events, because I knew that 9 teams out of 16 had basically decided, some of them already had signed contracts to make roster changes before the major started, because their contracts had already run out, so they've already signed new contracts. It was just like a temporary extension for the 1 extra month to get through the January major. So I thought that's a huge issue that is somewhat off of this, but still somewhat connected to the roster locks, where it's just it's very obvious that at least the rule set for the major, it just doesn't at all work for Counter-Strike. And there's multiple problems. The scheduling of the event, it's how long the qualification process is, and at the same time you could alleviate a lot of that by just changing the rules. But I think there's no way that this can be anywhere even close to the optimal rule set for how we're playing. And this is not even touching on cases like Kirby not being allowed to play for Astralis in Cologne 2016. I mean, I don't think anybody liked that, especially because Kirby had played for Dignitas at the qualifier, But because Astralis were already legends when they made the swap with KGB was allowed to play with Dignitas, but not the other way around, which is also somewhat a silly situation.
Counterintuitive, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And then we had these other cases that we talked about earlier in the show, which is, Dupree actually gets hospitalized and you can't have a sub. You have to play with your coach, or you don't have a coach because you can only add one extra player in the roster. And the same thing with NIP, where Pete couldn't get his visa, I think, sorted out for MLG Columbus, and then they had to play with Threat.
I think it was only for the first game, though, for that as well, or the group stage.
But
exactly. They also had a rule that you had to keep the same lineup.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think these are just silly rules. I think this seems like the kind of thing where someone's sitting in an office, he doesn't care at all what he's doing he just knows that he gets out at 5 and he needs to finish something before going home. Like, this is actually what it feels like to me when I look at these rules and these situations, when they keep happening over and over again. It just seems so obvious looking from the outside in. Like, why can't you just change it and everybody will be happier? Because I don't think there's a single team, because I understand like some players, they're motivated to make sure there's more stability. They want to keep their job. They don't want to risk getting replaced mid-season. That all makes sense. But like, I don't think there's any player who will say that, okay, well, if one of our players gets hospitalized, I think we should be forced to play with our coach, and we can't get a stand-in for that, because that's obviously a very, very specific case.
Okay. And I think that's something where we're just everybody in the ecosystem, the teams, the players have to be more vocal, because I think everybody conveys the idea that they are always being really vocal and always tell Valve how things are. But I know for a fact that for one of the biggest items, which was the coaching rule, where everybody said this is horrible and it's going to change everything and it's not going to be the same as before, there wasn't a lot of feedback sent to Valve on this, and everybody just accepted it at the end. So I think there's a lot of, and I get it as, if you're a game developer, then you can't follow every single detail of the ecosystem. So I think it's on the teams, on the players to, in a well-structured way, report back on what's going to be happening in the ecosystem, what's working, what isn't. And that's, it's something that where we had to take a flag for, the coaching rule. We basically reported back and said, what's happening is teams are using their coaches as in-game leaders. And if nothing changes about it, then that's what's going to happen. So I think if that happens more from the player side, if there's more structured feedback, there's, following issues with what happened at E-League Major, this didn't work, this didn't work, I think that would be better to adjust those rules. But my feeling is it doesn't happen enough. We're forcing the players to give us feedback on rules, but they wouldn't do it on their own. They would just go on Twitter if something happens that they're unhappy with. But apart from that, there isn't a whole lot of feedback that you get by sitting back and doing nothing. You have to really go out and get it. And I think that's also a key issue of why those things don't change, because there isn't enough request for change, basically.
No, I don't doubt it that the players definitely don't talk about any of this enough. I think a part of it is also that when it's something that they sort of disagree on, no one wants to be the bad guy. It's a lot easier to sort of jump on, say, like the Dennis thing and say, oh, let Dennis play for these guys because everybody's already on that train. It's actually good publicity for you. Like fans will say, oh, Thorin is such a good guy. He wants them to play with their best roster. So it's
especially if you know it's not going to happen. By the way, it's even better PR. You're like, no, I really think he should be allowed to play. What, you definitely not? Yeah, yeah, definitely.
But if we, if you crouch just a little bit, the ESL1 logo is not going to be visible. You take your ESL hat on. Do you actually? Maybe Duncan's already cropped that off, and this is not an issue. But okay, so there is a little ESL1 logo here that's visible for us. But if we take the ESL hat off for a second and assume that no one from Valve ever watches this, do you actually think that the Valve guys are receptible to talking to them? Because from what I've heard from a lot of people is they usually feel like it doesn't matter. Like obviously, they can't make every change player say, "Oh, change this thing." I just blindly follow that, especially because there's going to be contradictory statements that people don't talk about. But do you actually feel like they're receptive about feedback you give them, and how do they actually work with that?
Absolutely. My experience is completely different. I think every talk that we have with them, which is every couple of weeks, is really good. They're always really interested in what's going on in the ecosystem and what we think works and what doesn't. And they ask a lot of questions about things that happen. Multi-team ownership, obviously a big topic for them, for example. So those types of things I think they're really receptive. also proposed a few changes where we said, we're on Swiss system for qualifiers because we think it works really well, and then it was implemented. So my experience is that while they certainly don't do anything, and they have obviously their perspective on how they want certain things to work and what they consider important, what not, it's always been really good conversation. And I can't believe it's because we're ESL or because of how I personally am, but to me that's just the types of people they are. But it's probably a little more difficult to get to them than to other publishers because they don't have any directly outward facing roles like community managers. But my experience is really good. I mean, it's always been good conversations with them, and they're really interested in what's going on in the ecosystem and what maybe doesn't work and what works really well. But obviously they have a lot of data, and I think that's something also people ignore is when they say, well, this weapon doesn't work and this weapon doesn't work, is that they have data for the entire ecosystem, and that ecosystem includes everyone on matchmaking, and that's not what everybody likes, but that's I think an important thing. So that's I think where sometimes the disconnect comes from.
Well, that is their business, right?
Yeah, and for the coaching role, I think it came from them because I think the coaching, if we had a permanently talking coach as the in-game leader, it would lead to better CS, but it would also lead to CS at the top that's difficult to replicate for everyone else in the ecosystem, and that's their perspective on this, and that's I think something you have to respect. But my experience is that they're really receptive to feedback and really not difficult to talk to.
Okay. To close up the show, I just want to make one point and reiterate something lurppis said actually at the very beginning, which is that no matter what you think about the current rules, except for very exceptional circumstances, like someone literally being so ill they cannot attend the event, you can't change the rules while the season is going on. Like, you can in that case, because no one can exploit that. Like, in theory, okay, perhaps another team is so cynical and unethical that they're like, lie and say that you're ill so we can get a better player. First of all, it's very unlikely. And secondly, if you want to take that gamble and then one day when all your players leave and go to other teams, it comes out that actually you lied there, you will face the consequences of that entirely and the community wrath. So I don't think anyone really would exploit that loophole, But on the other instances, I have to say, this is another area where I was shocked by some of the community figures who are like influential people whose real perspective was, because I don't like this rule, change it right now so that this player can play. Like, that makes no sense at all. You can definitely say change it for next season. This is wrong. It should be changed. But it would actually be quite unethical to the other teams in the league to change at the last minute like that. Because, for example, let's say you made it so that you can just add this player at the end after the deadline. Now every team that didn't change after the deadline has just been unfairly punished because we want to change something now. So I'm not saying whether I agree or not on this instance, but you have to accept the rules now, argue against them, and change them for next season. We can't change them right this moment, or it's just chaos at that point in time, isn't it?
Yeah, the only way you could do it is you have to get everyone to agree, and even then, it is like Ulrich said, which is I think the right way to do it is it should always be up to the organizer, because when you already have a situation and then you go to the other team, which is, by the way, that legendary Karn thing that Duncan remembers, you put the pressure on the teams who haven't done anything right to then accommodate someone else. And if you don't say you agree to it, you actually kind of look bad. So I fully agree with what Duncan said.
Yeah, and I think that's, Hiko, when he made that call, or his team made the call to not replay the round, I think he got death threats. It was really bad when they went to the Brazil event. So that's not something you want the players to experience. So totally agree. And by the way, for Device, he was at our event in Oakland. So we have first-hand experience of his condition. So it's very hard to fake that, I think. And we're sympathetic. That's one thing that I still want to convey. It's absolutely sympathetic for this happening, and no problem making an exception for something like that of this magnitude, which nobody expected. But at the same time, like you said, right within the other rules that we've set.
Guys, I'm DW. I have won 3 majors in CSGO, and this is Thorin's YouTube channel.